And there we go. It's official. Welcome to our penultimate or next to last session discussing Jesus Interrupted. Next week will be our last and what I hope is a fruitful discussion of the last chapter in the book, in which he raises the question of faith, his own struggle with it, how he lost it. It's an age-old question that has been dealt with by people over the millennia in some interesting ways, some of which we will talk about, I hope, today. Last week, as I recall, we sort of focused on chapter 5. We never really got to chapter 6.
Yeah, kind of.
So today we're going to sort of wiggle between 6 and 7, because this is our last shot to be dealing with the historical stuff, what was happening in those sort of critical first 3 or 4 centuries, which sets then the stage for next week. And next week, as those of you who have been coming to my things fairly regularly, which is most of you, we'll talk about where you want to go next. And I will solicit some feedback, some input as to what might be of interest in the future. So that said, we can either talk about the chapter that we never really got to, which was the how we got the Bible. Oh, here's Rita. Excuse me. Rita, there she is. Almost.
Sorry I'm late.
There she is. We were beginning to worry about you.
Oh, I pressed that snooze alarm by mistake.
Uh-oh. All right, so I've already done the formal introduction. We're recording. We're just about to jump in. So if I didn't bring a whole bunch of, the 25-year-old newsprint things, because I just wanted to see if anybody had questions. Again, I'm not sure how much of the history that he brings in you guys are already aware of.
I can't say I am. This is all not all new to me, but it's
okay.
Yeah,
The question, I mean, there are obviously lots of questions, but one of the things he talks about in the beginning to chapter 7, his introduction, he talks about he's teaching in North Carolina. Okay, he's in the South, where evangelical or conservative fundamentalist Christianity is the more dominant strain. And so he talks about it's almost common sense among many Christians in this part of the world, he means the American South, that if you don't believe in the Bible, you cannot be a Christian. Most Christians in other part of the world, in fact, the vast majority of Christians throughout the history of the church, would find that common sense to be nonsense.
Mhm.
For most Christians, Christian faith is about believing in Christ and worshiping God through him. It is not about belief in the Bible. We preach the Bible. Okay, which Bible? Whose Bible? From which century's Bible? In which languages Bible?
That's all those inconvenient details.
Inconvenient truth?
Yeah.
Oh, I said it. Oh,
Yes.
yeah. And again, he keeps hammering, and after a while I say, okay, Bart, we've heard this the umpteenth time. He keeps saying, everything I presented in this book is not new.
Mhm.
It's 100 to 200 years old. And any pastor who went to a mainline denomination seminary was taught this, including yours truly. So he said, how come so many people in the pew, not to mention people on the street, have never heard of this stuff? What are people scared of? Knowledge?
Mhm.
Well,
Mostly.
yeah.
Division.
in this science, anti-science age in which we live? That's an open question. Which is exactly the point of our discussion next week.
What did he say?
He said, Lou said, we are afraid of doubt.
Oh, yeah.
Which, again, is the point of our discussion next week, which is when he's talking about why he lost his faith. And he lost his faith not because of anything he teaches in his New Testament class, but because of the experience of suffering in the world. Which, interestingly enough, he never really mentions. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about probably the first and most widespread heresy. That is what the winners get to call the losers.
Yeah.
Right? Which was Gnosticism, which was widespread in the ancient world. It's rooted, sometimes called Neoplatonism. And it existed in Hellenistic, in Jewish, and in early Christian variants. But one of, and I wrote it in here somewhere, give me a second to look through where I actually wrote it.
Isn't Masonic stuff sort of a tail end of that? Masonic?
I don't know enough about the Masons to be able to answer that question.
Good question.
The question was, is it related to the modern day Masons? And I don't know enough of, I'm not a Mason, I don't know anything about what they espouse, so I can't answer the question. Oh, phooey. It's somewhere, I think, in this. I apologize for my inability to find a terribly insightful comment. But I can't, and I'm not going to. One of the issues that, one of the reasons that Gnosticism was eventually branded as heresy, and of course, I think we've talked about, we didn't have a whole lot of source documents about Gnosticism.
Can you say what Gnosticism is?
Well, I'm getting to that. We knew it. There was a 4th century Christian writer, Irenaeus, who was the Bishop of Lyon in France, the Roman province of Gaul at the time, who wrote a tract against the heresies. And he quoted from some of their literature and then refuted the arguments therein. And for, 1900 years, that's most of what we had, until the discovery of a trove of papyri in Egypt, the Nag Hammadi library, in which we actually found this whole treasure trove of original documents that were 2,000 years old. Those have been slowly unwrapped, preserved, and translated. And you can now buy, you can go to the store, look up on Amazon, the Gnostic Gospels, for example, or the Gnostic. I don't personally have a copy, otherwise I would have brought it, but I did bring last week the Dead Sea Scrolls. And those discoveries were both in the immediate post-World War II period, 1947, 48, something like that. So we know a lot more about specifically the Christian iteration of Gnosticism. But Gnosticism in general was one of the ways in which the ancient world dealt with the question of suffering in the world, getting back to his issue. And one of the things it posited was that the God of the Old Testament was not the real supreme being. They posited that that God was what they called the demiurge, a sort of semi-God. And you could tell he wasn't the real God because his creation was so full of faults. It was a great attempt, but it was botched. And the evidence for its being botched was the persistence of pain and suffering and disease and hardship and misery in the world, because a God who was the supreme God would have done a much better job creating this creation. Now, there's a certain logic to that position. It makes a lot of sense.
And it takes a lot of pressure off of us.
Yeah, which is why it was so popular. And you can kind of see, I mean, Bart Ehrman is not the first guy to struggle with the question of suffering in the world. And if God is the all-powerful God, how come this world sucks? Right?
Because he made humankind.
Oh, well, yeah, and we've got all sorts of, this is one of the things that made me go into psychology. And, well, never mind. I don't want to get too far. Anyway, so, and the notion is that each one of us has a piece of the divine spark of the real God, the guy who's above the demiurge. And they found hints of this in Paul when talks about several heavens.
Mhm.
Again, that's, he's flirting with Gnosticism, that there's this world and then there are worlds above, and that this mortal body is almost like an anchor that is chaining our divine spark to this level of existence. And once we discover the truth about who we really are, and the word Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So once you have knowledge of the truth of the way the world really is, our goal is really to escape this world, which broadly sucks, and go back up to what became identified as heaven, that higher level of being where we become one we dwell in the Imperium, and we escape this veil of tears, as it were. Now, again, you and I today have no idea how hard life was 2,000 years ago. So if we're moaning, whining, or BMWing,
Yeah.
bitching, moaning, and whining about how hard life is now, you have no concept of a kind of life where the average life expectancy was 40 to 45 years, if you're lucky. And so again, you can sort of see the appeal of that sort of, and we have Gnostics living among us today. Those who claim special knowledge. Christian Scientists are one. The LDS has a lot of similarities in thought about that. Every male is going to become his own demiurge and have his own world to play in. Sorry, ladies. Yeah, it is a very misogynist mindset, but then that reflects the ancient world. That's not really a surprise.
Basically the way it is.
So when he's talking about who invented Christianity, the argument is really, how come those of us who won, what was wrong with those other notions? Because besides the Gnostics, you had the Nestorians, you had the Docetists, you had the Arians, you had all kinds of other subgroups. Because if you kind of imagine in the early days, it was a lot like 18th, 19th, 20th century Christianity, where anybody could pick up this divine book and interpret it and start his own church. And there's no central authority. So who's to say that you're wrong and I'm right? Because of course I'm right and you're wrong.
That's a really good point, that we're like in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah, if we disagree. There's no central authority. There's no boss. There's no higher somebody you could appeal to, except what the apostles taught. Now that gets us back to some of what we talked about last week with oral tradition. Because again, if you think the world is going to end a week from Tuesday, you don't bother setting up some sort of elaborate organizational structure. It's not worth the bother. You don't even bother writing down, because that's time consuming and in the ancient world expensive. You don't write down your oral tradition because you're not, why bother? The world isn't going to last long enough. So it's not until, year succeeds to year, and that second coming doesn't come, and those who were eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry are dead and pushing up daisies, that somebody says,
Maybe we ought to write this.
yeah, maybe we ought to, maybe
Make
we,
some notes.
yeah, maybe we have to start doing some of this stuff. That in, say, Paul's era, when he's saying, most of you are reading this letter now, will be alive to see this happen. And now when none of those people are alive anymore, and it still hasn't happened, that sort of mind shift. And again, the technical, in terms of biblical study, and again, he never mentions this phrase, which surprises me. He never mentions the delay of the parousia, which was drilled into our head in seminary, which is that the second coming that never came. And yet for some reason, that stuck. And so we recite it in the Nicene Creed every Sunday. And he will come again in power and glory. Really? When's he going to get around to it?
Not
All right.
for us to know.
Yeah. So, 1,000 years are like a day to God, right? So, okay, so it's going to be 40,000 years from now.
Yeah.
All right. So what are we supposed to do in the meantime? Set up a church with bishops, priests, and deacons, and maybe we better write some of this stuff down. So we start writing it down. You in your community write what you know, and I in my community write what I know. And it takes, 50 to 100 years for me to give you a copy of mine and you to give me a copy of yours, because again, writing is expensive, right? Everything has to be hand copied, sometimes by people who could not read what they were copying. They were just making the mark on this page look like the mark on that page. And sometimes they got it wrong. And sometimes there was ant that got squished or a fly that got squashed. And that changes that. If you study ancient languages and you see the original manuscripts, paper was expensive. You know what? So it's just a jumble of letters. There's no space between words.
It went all the way to the edges.
Absolutely.
I've noticed that.
Parchment was expensive.
When they reused it.
Yeah, this is all about economics, folks. It's driven by economics. So those kinds of manuscripts are called minuscules, where everything is written in lowercase, as opposed to uncials, which everything is written in uppercase. People who had more bucks could afford to write in uncials, but most folk, it was minuscules. All right, so if you don't know the language, you have no idea what group of squiggles equals a word. Or if you change a little squiggle, how that changes the meaning of the word.
Or you put the dot on the wrong side of a line or something.
Yes, because Greek has, three kinds of accents, and Hebrew, of course, as originally written, was all consonants. There were no vowels. Vowel pointing wasn't invented until the Middle Ages in Spain. So my Old Testament professor used to say, nobody really knows what that word means. Really? Because when I look at my English translation of the Bible, somebody made a pretty good guess as to what that word
I
meant.
know, I made a guess.
Yeah, they made a guess. But that's exactly what it was. So was that the inspired word of God? No, it's a guess.
That's right.
That's two words in the New Testament too, like that.
What? Yeah, because
More than that.
it's been a dead language.
Yeah.
It was a dead language for centuries in Jesus' day. They didn't speak Hebrew anymore. They spoke Aramaic. They're cousins, but so is Arabic and Hebrew. Once you get past the difference in the squiggles and transliterate it, they're very similar. because they're both Semitic languages,
Exactly.
but they're not Indo-European languages. They're not like Greek or Latin or any of the things that we speak today. So when you do that translation, there's whole levels of complexity that get involved in it. So how do we know that what we believe today is anything remotely like what Jesus taught?
It probably isn't.
Thank you. And that is his point in that chapter called Who Invented Christianity, is that the religion of Jesus has become the religion about Jesus, who never claimed to be divine. And the word Mashiach does not necessarily mean that, because Cyrus of Persia is called God's Messiah, for example. You don't even have to be Jewish
Well,
to be the Messiah.
I'll go back up a little bit, because the Pharisees definitely definitely knew that he was claiming to be the Messiah.
Yeah, but what did they understand by that term? Because he turned out to be a Messiah, and that's why the second.
Hardest thing, because he just claimed to be God. Jesus just claimed to be God. So
Yeah.
just like
Mike,
so that's
that's a narrative written 40 to 70 years after that happened.
well, okay. Well, that's
There was no scribe
yeah.
taking notes like in a court today. So did he really? We don't know.
We don't. Yeah. I mean, that's yeah.
Because again,
But yeah, just
one of the things he points at, if you look at the difference between what Jesus says about himself in Mark and what is said about him in John,
yeah.
it's a very different portrayal.
Yeah, the similarity.
There's the low Christology and the high Christology. So all of the, hold on a minute, let me give some more history and then we'll argue some more. Talk some more. Almost all of the early sort of controversies or heresies had to do with how we understand how they understood who this guy really was. Some of them had to do with other doctrinal things. For example, Nestorianism came from the notion that if you were a Christian, especially a priest, and your community came under persecution, and while you were being tortured or threatened with being thrown to lions or whatever the Romans in that area wanted to do to you, you recanted your faith in Christ. And then you were spared. And then the persecution passed and things went back to normal. And you wanted to keep being a priest. You were forbidden because you personally had abandoned the faith. Now, that sounds like a fairly reasonable argument, right?
I know someone who did it. Named Peter.
What did he say?
Lou says, I know someone who did. His name was Peter. And you're right. So at some point, some bishops got together and said, because of examples like Peter, said no. And they came up with a doctrine which has the Latin name Ecclesia Suppa, which is the church supplies the grace conferred at ordination, because if every priest had to live perfectly, nobody's orders would be valid and none of the sacraments would be valid, because nobody can live up to that high standard. So that was one that didn't have to do, but most of the Arianism, Docetism, Gnosticism, all were rooted in how do we understand who Jesus is. Now, as long as the message of early Christianity was taught in the synagogues to people who knew the Messianic hope, who understood that terminology, who could give a rip whether or not this guy was actually a descendant of King David, that made sense. But as soon as you're Paul and you start preaching to Greeks who have no background in Jewish history or theology and couldn't care less that this guy claimed to be a descendant from David, And your mythology in Hellenistic culture is full of half human, half divine figures because Zeus got around. Right?
Yes.
So it's pretty easy to say, oh, so this Jesus is half God, half human. God the Father, Mary. We get that. That's Hercules,
Yeah.
along with a long list of other people. And they said, no, that's not what we mean. He's all one and all the other. And it was, wait a minute. You can't be all human and all divine at the same time. Half and half we get. Whole and whole, that doesn't compute. That doesn't make any sense.
Except it did, yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Not in the cultural context. If you're Greek,
No, I'm going somewhere else.
it doesn't make sense. So you have two solutions to the problem. One is he was all divine and only appeared to be human. That's the Docetists, because dokein in Greek means to appear or to look like. So Jesus only appeared to be human. He only appeared to suffer on the cross. He didn't really, because he was God. And God can't suffer and still be God. So it's got to be one or the other. Arianism, he wasn't, as John would have said, present at the beginning, part of God from the beginning. No, God made him later because a father makes a son later. The father and the son don't exist at the same time. Again, by their way of thinking, that makes no sense. So we have to work a way around it. By the 4th century, that is the 300s, when Constantine has converted to Christianity, and all of these varying ideas are literally causing riots in the streets, if you're the civil authority, you got to do something. Okay, we got to smack that bud down. So you call a council. It's called Nicaea. That's the place where you have it in 325. And you say, all right, guys, you're locked in this room and I'm not letting any of you out until you settle this mess. And that gave us the Nicene Creed. So from somewhere around 30 AD to 325 AD, or a process of 300 years, there's a lot of fluidity.
Fluidity, is that what you said?
Fluidity. Yeah, there's a lot of different notions floating around and a lot of arguments. And Nicaea wasn't the only council. There were gobs of them, where various groups got together and they had these sorts of theological debates. It's how they decided what would or would not be considered scripture. The church decided what was in the Bible. The church came first, not the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's changed. Some things that were considered scriptural were pitched out.
It is fascinating. The first 300 years.
Yeah.
of
And
spread of Christianity.
and John only barely made the cut because John has some hints of Gnosticism.
I barely made the cut. I love that.
True.
Well, what, wasn't it down to one person standing pat that they wanted revelation?
Well, yeah, and Revelation is another one. Well, again, and that gets to how broadly in the church was the apocalyptic worldview. And again, I didn't bring that poster because you've already seen it, but that has its roots in Persian Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism for Zoroaster. And if you remember that the Jews were part of the Persian Empire for a couple of hundred years, which is why Cyrus of Persia in Isaiah 40 is called God's Mashiach, because he defeated the Chaldeans, who were the ones who destroyed the first temple. And they were part of the Persian Empire until Alexander conquers the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC. So there's a couple hundred years. So and that's where that's the root of the split between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees sort of went along with that broad cultural understanding. The Sadducees said, no, Moses never talked about anything like that. We don't buy it. So the Sadducees were kind of the purists. They controlled the worship in the temple, and that was fine until there was no temple, which occurred in 70 AD. And so all you had left of the two major and two minor strands of Judaism in the first century that we know of, the only one that survived the aftermath of the Jewish revolt were the Pharisees, because they were spread all over in the synagogues. So that's the version of Judaism that survived. And of course, we haven't even talked about, there was a second Jewish revolt. But anyway, so this is a period of a lot of fluidity, a lot of debate, not unlike what we have today.
Can I add something? You're not going to like
I
it.
don't know.
You're not going to like it. You're not going to like it.
Go ahead, sweetie.
Okay.
That's Rita.
So in what you just said, the year 325 was the Council of Nicaea, right?
Yes.
And they declared that Jesus was both human and divine, right? Wasn't that declared in that one?
Yeah, that was, and that was the struggle between so-called Orthodoxy and Arianism.
So in the little Mary person over here, the little Catholic Mary person over here,
Yeah.
in 431, they went and declared Mary Theotokos, which if Jesus was divine and Mary was the mother of Jesus, then Mary could be called the mother of God. Thank you very much. That's us.
And the point of that in this discussion was what?
Well, we were just declaring what was God. And I had to add my little Catholic thing about Mary.
So what you're saying is that Christian theology continued to evolve. Yeah, because as I said, Nicaea was not the only council.
Right,
There were many before then, and there were many after that.
right.
Because just because the so-called Orthodox outvoted the Arians at the Council of Nicaea does not mean that Arianism simply just dissolved and went away in a poof. It didn't.
No, it lasted a couple of centuries, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty popular and widespread. So, and then I didn't even
Well,
mention.
they're trying to understand, right? They're trying to understand.
Well,
Besides
we're still
power
trying
and
to
ruling, they're what?
We are still trying.
Trying to understand.
We're still trying to make sense of this, and that again will lead us to this discussion next week of, okay, if I can't trust the Bible, what can I trust? Because that's really where we're going with this.
Yeah. And that was his dilemma. That was Bart's dilemma.
Yeah, which gets
He was such
to-
in a mindset, and when that got shaken, he didn't know what to do.
Yeah, because he came out of that sort of rigid evangelical viewpoint. Now, those of us who are Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, and even certain well-educated Roman Catholics, like the Jesuits, for example, like he mentions Ray Brown, one of my heroes.
Mhm.
I love Ray's books. Who's one of the preeminent Johannine scholars, who wrote the book that I highly recommend, The Churches the Apostles Left Behind, where he addresses what was going on in those communities after the last one who could say, I saw, is pushing up daisies. And that end of the age still hasn't happened. And they have to wrestle with, what do we do now? It's hard to imagine what that would have been like, you know?
Yeah.
And the uncertainty and the anxiety. I mean, I turned it into a psychological issue. How do people deal with anxiety? Well, we're seeing it in our culture right today. When we feel culture threatened. In fact, after I finished rereading Bart's book yesterday, I picked up another book that I had started, discovered to my chagrin, has been sitting on my shelf for 11 years.
I have books like that.
Yeah, called The Science of Evil.
Wow.
And it's a psychological exploration of the circuits in the brain that are involved in empathy.
Hmm.
And he doesn't realize he's parroting Augustine of Hippo. This is what is evil is a privatio boni, an absence of good. So addressing the question, how can human beings do horrible things to other human beings? And this author is British and Jewish.
Mm.
It is the absence of empathy.
Mm.
And so he's talking about the research that's been done, which is fascinating, mostly with borderlines and psychopaths. Says there hasn't been enough research done with narcissists, but they
I was
all
gonna
have,
say narcissists, yeah.
yeah, they all have a zero negative capacity for empathy. And then he talks about zero positive, and those are people with autism and Asperger's.
Zero what?
Zero positive as opposed to zero negative in terms of an empathy scale from 0 to 6. It was fascinating. I got about halfway through the book. So I may bring it next week and say, if you want to deal with where does suffering comes from in the world, to the extent that is human caused, as
Mhm.
opposed to,
Yeah,
natural disasters.
Mhm.
That might be something that we want to explore. How have people dealt with or tried to respond to the presence of evil or suffering in the world? Both in terms of ancient ideas like Gnosticism, religions in general. What is, as Jung would say, that sort of religious function of the psyche? We're reading and I. Sandy, when you were at Pacifica, did you have classes from Lionel Corbett?
Yes, I did.
Okay, all right. So this all three of us had classes from this guy who I think is brilliant.
It was heavy into spirituality or included elements of that, but I can't remember particularly anything that he taught. I just know his
Okay.
writings did lean towards the spiritual.
Yeah, his focus was the title of what his probably most famous book was called The Religious Function of the Psyche.
Psyche.
Mhm.
So how is it that human beings throughout history and all around the world all develop some sort of notion of a greater than human reality? God or gods?
Mhm.
Why is that? Now, well, if you're a Jungian, you'd say, well, there's an archetypal structure in the psyche that makes all of us go there.
An archetypal memory too, perhaps.
Maybe. That gets in what really is an archetype. Not necessarily a memory, but this thing that Jung called the collective unconscious.
Right, that's it.
Yeah, that deeper structure of the psyche that unites all of us and helps create these enduring patterns that we keep seeing reiterated in different cultures all across the globe and across time. And the posthumous book, Man and His Symbols, was an attempt at sort of demonstrating this. If you look at the sand paintings of the Tibetans and the sand paintings of the Navajo, there's a lot of similarity.
Yeah.
Why is that? It's not cross-cultural contamination because they're on opposite sides of the planet.
No, it's something that, in technical terms, it's hardwired into the human.
Exactly.
Where it probably goes south is when we make too much of that fact that we are hardwired for these certain feelings, but then we try to find more that is truly there. That didn't come out well.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
sure. I would say when we concretize our expression and anathematize everybody else's,
And yeah.
like,
Oh, that's a good way.
or ours is the true faith.
Oh, that sounded really good, David. Concretize. You got it.
Thank you.
it gets back to that book that you brought here for another discussion we had in another class, about the numinous idea of the holy.
Oh,
yeah.
yes,
That's a
the
great-
Otto's,
That
the idea of the holy.
We
Or,
missed that. What did Mike say?
he was recalling in probably the discussion of
it was a young one of your.
of the undiscovered self last fall. I brought in a book by Rudolf Otto called The Idea of the Holy. That's the English
Right.
translation, which is a mistranslation. The German title is simply Das Heilige, which is the Holy, which was published in 1917, right at towards the end of the First World War, and was highly influential to Jung. And the term the numinous comes from that book.
Sense of awe.
Yeah. And he's talking about religious experience in the sense of a transformative, knocks you on your keister like Paul on the road to Damascus. What is that like? And actually, thank you for bringing that up, because we're going to contrast that next week. What is the role of direct religious experience versus believing in a book?
That's a good.
Okay. Do you believe in God because of a book written 2,000, 3,000 years ago? Or do you believe in God because you've had a direct experience? And what is that role? I mean, I can tell you about mine. Hiking out of the Grand Canyon at sunrise when I was 14. And everybody's, well, not everybody, but a lot of people have those. That makes you sort of go, whoa, there's something else going on here, and I don't quite know what it is, but it's kind of intriguing.
Mhm.
And then everybody's path goes from there. So again, getting back to, so the faith, once delivered to the saints, wasn't one faith, and it didn't drop out of heaven as a concrete, all worked out thing. It took centuries. Which begs the question, does that mean if it was evolving back then, is it still now?
Yes. Absolutely.
Do we still take some direction from this 2,000-year-old book, but do we apply it literally?
Depends on who you are.
Well, yeah. And where you live and how you look at it and how much weight you put in this or that passage. As Bart points out in the last chapter, we don't stone people for having premarital sex these days.
Unless you're in Afghanistan.
Unless you're in Afghanistan, but that's a whole different issue.
Yeah.
And they are like certain Christian groups were about 300 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you read that Nathaniel Hawthorne recently?
Yeah.
Calvin's Vienna.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and there's that sort of rigidity, and it's right or it's wrong, which gets hold back to the argument between, say, Calvin and Luther. Or how are we saved? By following rules or by faith? You're going to put your emphasis on James or Paul? Do we earn our way into heaven, or is it a gift of grace? It depends. We're still fighting over these same questions.
Absolutely.
They haven't gone away.
We've had the Christian Taliban around for centuries.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
say that again.
We've had the Christian Taliban around for centuries.
Yeah, yeah. We don't call them that, of course. We call them legalists. We call them all sorts of things. But yeah, is it rules based? And again, one of the things that led me into psychology is who are the kinds of people who feel comfortable with rules
Mhm. Yeah.
versus, yeah. And there's a fascinating book that was published in 2014 by Avi Tushman called Our Political Nature. evolutional roots of our political differences. And he talks about the difference in personality structures between so-called conservatives and liberals. That's another book I've mentioned before. It's fascinating, and it helps me personally. It helped me humanize those with whom I strongly disagree politically, and say, I don't agree with you, but I understand why you have a need to feel that way.
Why you have this personality deficiency.
It's not a personality deficiency. It's having a stronger trait in this area versus this area. However, taken to extremes, you become the shooter in Buffalo.
You mentioned it earlier, David, when you said that's why you studied psychology.
Yeah,
The reason I did was to find out why people do what they do.
exactly.
Exactly. It's like it doesn't make sense until you go, oh, yeah, now it makes sense.
Yeah.
And there's so much in fear and anxiety and
Yeah. And in my case, after being in parish ministry for 15 years, it was, why do people who call themselves Christians act like such non-Christians?
Right.
yeah.
Looking at the fights and the battles and the backstabbing and stuff in churches.
Oh, really? That goes on in
Because I
churches?
moved from here to Los Angeles. No, it wasn't. You all can't say that. Because it's universal.
Why do liberals and progressives fight?
Because
Right.
you got to read Tushman's book and you'll answer that question. Because he does answer the question.
Okay.
Conscientiousness versus openness.
And both are good.
Well, yeah, it's not that one is bad and one is good. We need both of
We don't
those.
have-
We need both of those qualities.
Right.
I mean, because there's a part of me that likes following rules and having familiarity and a structure, and there's nothing wrong with it until you take it too far. So think of the bell curve, right?
Yeah.
When you get way out on the wings,
You're in dangerous
yeah,
territory.
yeah. And this book I'm halfway through now is the same thing, but it's about empathy. You know, if you have zero empathy, your life is fine because you don't give a shit about anybody else.
Yeah.
But everybody else around you is suffering. If you're on the other hand, if you're a highly sensitive person, everything is painful.
Yeah.
Because you're so sensitive, you're so in tune with everybody's misery that you're miserable yourself.
Well, that was the theme of a very early Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But which was an incredibly insightful and way ahead of its time show.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right, with that, folks, we got to quit for today because we're out of time. So stay tuned. See you next week for our final discussion. Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for
Sounds good. Thank you, David.
Dave, bye-bye.
Bye.